I'm honored to be here and I'm honored to be a part of this conference. It is a true privilege to speak with you all Christian brothers and sisters. And I'm following two distinguished speakers, I must say. It's amazing that we did not coordinate our talks because you will hear many echoes in my talk of what David and Valerio said in their excellent presentations. So I'd like to start this talk on serving God in society and government with some remarks on the postmodern age that we live in. And I'd like to illustrate that then by discussing a key recent declaration of the United Nations, an institution that is a leading vehicle of postmodernism, in my view, in global politics. Like it or not, we live in the postmodern age, characterized by a postmodern worldview. Though it is impossible to fully describe the postmodern worldview in the time we have, and I'm not going to even come close to making an attempt, I would like to share the following quite useful definition of postmodernism. I quote, "Postmodernism is a movement in Western philosophy characterized by broad skepticism, subjectivism, or relativism, a general suspicion of reason, and an acute sensitivity to the role of ideology in asserting and maintaining political and economic power," close quote. Although very few people take an interest in postmodernism and even fewer truly understand it, I think it's safe to say that in Europe and North America especially, postmodernism has trickled down virtually unnoticed into almost all areas of life. The suspicion of truth, the suspicion of reason, the idea that truth claims only have to do with power struggles has all become part of our daily lives. And in the political realm, postmodernism, fueled by this rejection of the old certainties of Enlightenment modernism, is bringing about a transvaluation of all political values, a deconstruction and redefinition, sometimes an abolition, of many of the political categories of modernism. Concepts such as, for example, the nation state, human rights, international law, even man himself, the political subject at the most basic level, are being deconstructed in order to achieve a new world of what we are trying to figure out now in our postmodern age is justice, freedom, and peace. So let me illustrate this political postmodernism with the UN quote that I mentioned just now. In September 2015, the United Nations established the Sustainable Development Goals for the period from 2015 to 2030. The Sustainable Development Goals are the successors to the Millennium Development Goals that the United Nations laid out in the year 2000 for the 15 years until 2015. The effort to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030 is at the very top of the agenda of the international community in our time. A solemn declaration of the heads of state and government on the Sustainable Development Agenda entitled "Transforming Our World, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development," marks the way forward toward the global elimination of extreme poverty and hunger. I find the following excerpts from the declaration especially revealing. I quote, "We, the heads of state and government, meeting at the United Nations from 25 to 27 September 2015, resolve between now and 2030 to end poverty and hunger everywhere, to combat inequalities within and among countries, to build peaceful, just, and inclusive societies, to protect human rights and promote gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls, and to ensure the lasting protection of the planet and its natural resources. We resolve also to create conditions for sustainable, inclusive, and sustained economic growth, shared prosperity, and decent work for all, taking into account different levels of national development and capabilities. This is an agenda of unprecedented scope and significance. It is applicable to all people. We envisage a world free of poverty, hunger, disease, and want, where all life can thrive. A just, equitable, tolerant, open, and socially inclusive world in which every country enjoys sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth and decent work for all. Close quote. Now, most people would express themselves somewhat more modestly than the heads of state do in this declaration. It is an exaggerated claim, to say the least, that one can achieve in only 15 years a world completely free of poverty, hunger, disease, and all kinds of other troubles that human beings have experienced since time immemorial. Nevertheless, the Sustainable Development Goals are obviously in accord with the fundamental objective of all legitimate politics, the improvement of the conditions under which human beings live. Certainly, the desire to bring about a better world is praiseworthy, and there is global consensus behind this project. Almost all of the heads of state and government in the entire world joined in this declaration that I just quoted from, including all of the EU member states, probably all of the European states, and the United States. They were unanimous in lauding the Sustainable Development Agenda as the most important political project of the international community in the 21st century. So what about us as Christians? Can we take this declaration and the Sustainable Development Agenda it describes as guideposts, pointing the way to how Christians should think about and engage in politics in the postmodern age? I don't think so. In fact, I believe that this declaration represents the exact opposite of what a carefully considered Christian approach to politics should be. Instead, the Agenda 2030 declaration reads like a political gospel, a message of salvation through government. One gets the impression that nothing other than the skill and determination of the best human minds is needed in order to solve the world's problems. God need not apply. We, the heads of state and government, will manage just fine alone. Thank you very much. The Sustainable Development Declaration reeks of practical atheism, of living and thinking, whether consciously or subconsciously, as if God did not exist. Now, before I talk more about some challenges for Christian engagement in politics in the postmodern era, I'd like to go back to the roots, so to speak, to the pre-modern era, and make some comments about the light that Holy Scripture sheds on politics. What does the Bible say about politics and government? It actually does not say much, at least directly. Politics is not a primary concern of Scripture. In my view, that's also a message of the Bible. Don't put politics first. Jesus said his kingdom is not of this world. Politics is not the way to transform our world. The 13th chapter of Paul's letter to the Romans probably contains the Bible's most clearly elaborated statement on politics, government, and the role of the Christian in the political realm. Beginning in verse 1, Paul writes, quote, "Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted. For the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer." Close quote. I think it's significant to remember that according to most biblical scholars, Paul wrote Romans during the beginning of the reign of the Roman Emperor Nero, who was one of the most invidious persecutors of Christians in world history. Nevertheless, he wrote, "Be subject to the governing authorities." In the same line as Romans 13, Martin Luther writes in his treatise To the Christian Nobility of the German Nation, a fantastic treatise, by the way, that I would recommend everyone to read. He writes, quote, "The temporal authorities hold the sword and the rod in their hands to punish the wicked and to protect the good." To punish the wicked and to protect the good. And that actually sums up more or less the Bible's principal statement on politics. Protect the wicked, protect the good, and punish the wicked. Now, it is not my intention to oversimplify, but it does appear to me that as a general principle, the Bible's perspective on government and politics is very sober and modest. The Bible does not speak of the elimination of poverty and hunger within a generation. It does not speak of a fundamental transformation of the world through politics, nor does it have anything to say about grandiose plans and projects and goals and targets that emanate from New York or Washington or Brussels or Berlin or Geneva or Strasbourg. Instead, the Bible seems to say that politics is meant to provide a framework of stability and order within which people can live out their lives in relative peace. And without a doubt, the purpose of the stability and order that politics seeks to bring about is to give people the opportunity to serve God and their fellow human beings. Note that political institutions and government should not take our place in serving. Rather, politics and government should create an area of freedom within which the people, we ourselves, can perform the service that God calls us to perform. And all of that is of the highest relevance to the theme of this talk, serving God in society and government. If I were to try to explicate the phrase to punish the wicked and protect the good, or to reformulate it, I might say that the goal of Christian political engagement should be to restrain the evil in human beings and human institutions as far as that is possible for us as fallen women and men in a fallen world, in order to open up an area of freedom in which people can do good works with as little hindrance as possible in the political, social, and economic realms. So what are these good works, this service to God and our fellow human beings that Christians in politics and government should strive to promote? From this perspective, the Bible has much to say that applies to politics, even if indirectly. Let me quote a few passages that speak especially powerfully to me. James 1, verse 27. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. Psalm 12, verse 5. Because the poor are plundered and the needy groan, I will now arise, says the Lord. I will protect them from those who malign them. And an echo of David's talk, Micah 6, verse 8. He has shown you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? To act justly and love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. So with that, I conclude basically the first half of my remarks. And I conclude it with this. The heart of the matter is that whether we are talking about politics and government 3,000 years ago in Old Testament times, or about our own 21st century, we as Christians must always ask the basic question, what does the Lord require of us? And fundamentally, the answer to that question is from age to age the same. To walk humbly with our God to act justly and to love mercy, to look after orphans and widows, the poor and the needy in their distress. So in the rest of this presentation, I'll try to shed some light on what all of that might mean in our postmodern age. And I'll try to accomplish that from 4 vantage points. Firstly, I'd like to elucidate a number of key principles, again, very, very quickly. The Christian view of the human being, human dignity, and the essence of freedom and responsibility. Secondly, I'd like to examine what has become of the question of human rights in the postmodern West, echoes of David. Thirdly, I'd like to critically examine the popular postmodern concept of global governance. The UN Declaration on Sustainable Development that I just cited exemplifies quite strikingly this spirit of global governance. And finally, I'll conclude with some short remarks on what all of that might mean for serving God and society in government. So first, the Christian view of the human being, human dignity and the essence of freedom and responsibility, and the implications of these key principles for Christian engagement in politics in today's postmodern age. Christian thinking about politics must be grounded in a true view of man. This true view of the human being is summarized very well in a document called The Relevance of the Christian View of the Human Being, which was published in 2001 by the Values Commission, the Wertekommission, of the German political party, the Christian Democratic Union, the CDU. By the way, in quoting this document, I'm neither endorsing nor criticizing the CDU. Here's a translation from the original German. Quote, "The human person is created by God and thus possesses unconditional dignity. This entails both freedom and responsibility. It is the foundation of the universally valid rights of all human beings and the basis of our responsibility within the realm of politics. It obligates us to act in solidarity with the weak, to strive for justice, and to protect all human life in responsibility before God and man." Close quote. As you notice, all of these key principles are in close relation to each other. If you unpack one of them, freedom or dignity or the others, you will come in contact with all of them. Let me now attempt to unpack very quickly the basics of the principle of freedom. What is freedom? Most people have forgotten what freedom is. The German-British Catholic thinker, Lord Acton, once characterized freedom very incisively as the right to do what one ought and not to do what one would like to do. The right to do what one ought and not to do what one would like to do. That definition is reminiscent of what I said earlier about Christian political engagement being aimed at restraining evil and creating an area of freedom for doing good. And it harks back to the Values Commission's advocacy of what it called freedom in responsibility. But we often forget one thing that has implications for government. Freedom and responsibility means not only responsibility before God and our fellow human beings, but also responsibility for ourselves. As the American sociologist Charles Murray writes, self-respect, intimate relationships, and self-actualization require freedom in the only way that freedom is meaningful. Freedom to act in all arenas of life, coupled with the responsibility for the consequences of those actions. When the government intervenes to help, it not only diminishes our responsibility for the desired outcome, it enfeebles the institutions, the family, the church, the local associations through which people live satisfying lives. When the government intervenes and takes some of the trouble out of doing the things that families and communities evolved to do, it inevitably takes some of the action away from families and communities. The web frays and eventually disintegrates. Close quote. It is for that reason the idea of freedom and responsibility that Christian thinking about politics entails the strict limitation of government power. and government must be strictly limited precisely for the sake of the poor and the weak. Looking after the poor and the weak means creating incentives and opportunities for them to take care of themselves as much as they can, to earn their own living in dignity and responsibility. The social safety net of government aid for those who need it is necessary, but the safety net should hold people only until they can again provide for themselves. It should not entangle them in a permanent state of dependency on government aid. And that has implications not only for national governments, but also for every global development agenda, including our sustainable development agenda. People themselves and their dignity as human beings must be the core concern of all policy, rather than bombastic declarations of the international community that claim to lead the way into a fundamentally transformed world order. Development policy should not impose on people a globally transformative plan from the top down. Rather, it must strive to create an area of freedom that people need in order to take hold of their own future, to plan, act, and build their lives for themselves as image bearers of God who possess inalienable dignity. Now let me move to the second of my final themes, the question of human rights. What are human rights in reality, and what has become of them in the postmodern West? The answer to the question of human rights, as we've seen, of what they are, is not self-evident. What you believe human rights are depends on what you believe about human beings. And here we've seen that the postmodernist worldview change that I just outlined, namely the turning away from a basically Judeo-Christian culture, firmly rooted in tradition and truth, to a secularized culture characterized by relativism, novelty, and as the highest precept, choice, has profoundly affected the idea of human rights. Based on the notion of the absolute autonomy of the individual, the notion of choice taken to its ultimate extents, the new human rights are transformative and radically liberationist. How so? Here are some examples. Under the new human rights, women are liberated from the constraints of raising offspring, having been given the right to choose whether to keep or to dispose of their unborn children. Children's rights also threaten to become transformative. The postmodern view of children's rights liberates them from their parents, according children the right to decide for themselves who they are and what they believe before they are capable of handling or even understanding such decisions. And in the sexual arena, the transformative aspect of the new human rights is central, as the concept of fluid, self-defined gender identity overrides even the empirical reality that every human being is either a man or a woman. The postmodern view of rights posits the primacy of the unbounded right to choose. Each human being can choose to transform his very nature, and in so choosing, not only transform himself, but also liberate himself from the constraints of any and all social bonds, including those of family, community, tradition, religion, and even God himself. The new human rights are deeply destructive. They deconstruct human nature. It is a primary task of any Christian political engagement to oppose the new human rights with commitment, perseverance, and persistence, and to do so out of love for God and for the human beings, all human beings, who are made in his image. Now I'd like to move quickly to the third theme, global governance. Global governance is an idea that is as old as the Tower of Babel, yet it is utterly postmodern and closely tied to the new human rights that I just discussed. Everyone today talks about global governance, and most people seem to think it's a great idea. The declaration that we heard on the Sustainable Development Agenda is a perfect example of the spirit of global governance. I would define global governance, again, hard to define, but I would define it as follows. Global governance is the attempt to introduce a global rule of law in the interest of achieving an unprecedented degree of global peace, stability, and prosperity, not via a one world government, but rather by the development of an ever more comprehensive network of international institutions that administer an ever greater body of international law to which nations are subject, and that binds them not only in their foreign policy, but also in substantial areas of their domestic policy. The key to global governance is the development of a global rule of law, whereby no one knows exactly what this global rule of law will look like in the end. Now, it is good and proper, of course, to pursue international cooperation and negotiated agreements among nation states. It's good and proper for nations to come together in international organizations and to use those international organizations as vehicles to engage in dialogue and promote peace. Unfortunately, however, global governance seems to call for a much more extensive agenda than just the traditional pursuit of international cooperation. After all, there's much to do. Human rights must be guaranteed, poverty must be eradicated, suffering must be brought to an end, and the planet saved from cataclysm and made sustainable. And for those reasons, global governance needs ever more power, more and more power to secure the bright global future. I think I'm going over here, so I'll try to abbreviate the last part of my comments. And the new human rights are a core element of this brightest of all possible global futures. One could already see the unbreakable link between the global governance agenda and the new human rights, for example, in the pronouncements of the International Conference on Population and Development, held in Cairo in 1994, and in the World Conference on Women held in Beijing in 1995, and in many parts of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, as well as in all of the projects, events, and documents that have since sought to consolidate and further elaborate on these milestones in the global governance movement. Now, the problem, though, is that once you've jettisoned the idea of objective and authoritative truth, the idea that you can know what human nature is and believe that truth and that truth is unchanging, it becomes inevitable that the new human rights will be caught up in a never-ending process of redetermination and redefinition to fit within a post-truth paradigm that's by its very nature is subject to constant change and shape-shifting. And who's going to lead this process of redetermination? Well, inevitably, it will be none other than those who hold political power. Because once you've given up on the idea of objective truth, power can be attained and held and justified only by coercion. In principle, no relativist is far from Mao Zedong's famous dictum, political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. Just as ominously, there's no authoritatively objective basis for limiting political power once attained. There is no truth above and independent of the political authority in postmodernism that could limit that political authority. And with a global reach of communications, travel, commerce, and idea, the global rule of law expands geographically as well. And global governance thus unmasks itself not as a desire to improve the lot of humanity, but instead as an unlimited power grab to define truth and justice under the banner of universal human rights. So we have to resist this. We have to be witnesses against our age, in a certain sense, as Christians in society and government. So let me conclude with what all of this might mean for us. In this time of the transvaluation of all political values, the time in which freedom is misunderstood as the right to define oneself anew and in isolation from all constraints, and in which human rights are founded upon a constantly changing post-human view of human nature, in which global governance seeks to dissolve the democratically accountable nation state with an unreal and intangible top-down system of governance. In this time, it's our responsibility as Christians to be the voices of those calling in the wilderness. In all humility and sobriety, we must call Europe and America especially back to freedom in truth. We know that the accomplishments of the West did not just occur by chance, but that the relative peace, freedom, and stability that we enjoy in the West arose out of Judeo-Christian soil, and that this Judeo-Christian civilizational basis remains indispensable if we want to sustain the blessings of our salvations. And we must curb our ambition in many ways. We as Christians must remember that we, as much as anyone else, are subject to the temptations of our time. We too must guard ourselves against the postmodern temptation to believe that we can transform the world and liberate humankind through politics. Politics and government will never transform the world. But if we trust God and humbly seek the good of the city to which God has carried us, then we have reason to hope that God will bless our efforts to restrain evil and create more space for the good. Seeking the good of the city is a task that will not end until Christ returns in glory, be it pre-modern, modern, or postmodern. Thank you.